I'm so glad to be here, and thanks everyone for coming online for this. I'll be sharing some thoughts on the way that I think evolution and design can be compatible with each other. And I think this is relevant to you whether or not you believe in evolution. A lot of the points will still be useful. And I guess there's a whole spectrum of opinions on what would count as evolution that people may or may not believe in. So hopefully something in here will be useful for you, whatever your particular view is. My research has been in microbial evolution across quite a few different things. I wouldn't say I'm a specialist in any of these things particularly. There's just some warning that I kind of dabble across a few things, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in some of the crucial topics like phylogenetics or population genetics, or many other crucial related fields. So that's the first note. And the second note I want to say is I think this is not just theoretical, at least for me. I have presented it at quite a few different university mission weeks or similar contexts in Germany, Austria, Italy, New Zealand, other places, and I found it fruitful, I think. So I think this approach or something like it does actually offer a useful natural theology, not just a theoretical speculation. These are the three things I want to talk about. Firstly, what are design arguments? What's the general logic of a design argument? And then secondly, why do I think common descent is a true theory about the world? And then the focus is on how do we put these two things together? How can we have design arguments which are compatible with common descent? And I think compatible with evolution more broadly, but that's something that I'm very happy to talk about. My focus will be largely just on common descent. Okay, one of the questions, the only question that was received so far is, what does evolution mean? So I want to highlight that quickly to start with. I think that everything I say will be compatible with a fairly standard Darwinian view of evolution, so the strictest possible view in some sense, at least when we consider it only at the strictly scientific level. So by that, I mean, what I say should, I think, be compatible with evolution from a single cell via mutation and natural selection, where the mutations were random with respect to their environment. And that's the standard broad definition of Darwinian evolution. And the action of natural selection is illustrated on the right here. I'm also very, very open to external intervention in this process. But I think following Alvin Plantinga and other philosophers, that even the strictest standard Darwinian views are strictly compatible with the possibility of intervention. And if you're interested in that, please see his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, and some other references I can give you if you're interested. Okay, design arguments are, of course, made famous by William Paley with his analogy of finding a watch. And I think the point of that analogy is if you stumble across a watch, it just obviously looks designed. If you stumble across a rock or some other natural things, they don't so obviously look designed. But something which is so intricately combined together towards a functional purpose, it just looks straightforwardly designed. And a design argument, at least following the kind that follows Paley, says that there's things in the natural world that also look that have the same appearance of design, and there's different ways that you can flesh that out, and I'll talk through that a little bit. And of course, the famous example from the last 25 years is the bacterial flagellum in microbiology. And actually, my professor Zachary Ardern has been talking about that for close to 40 years now, but it was made famous approximately 25 years ago by Michael Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box. Also, just another kind of warning note, I just take it for granted that we can and should do natural theology. So that's part of the background behind my presentation. That I think we should be looking for things in the natural world that do point to God. I think that's what the Bible teaches, but I recognize that some Christians do disagree on the whole project as well. So I want to draw a distinction between design arguments and design intuitions. If we start on the right here with design intuitions, a really nice explanation of some of this is found in this book, Born Believers, by Justin Barrett. where he shows on the basis of lots of research in psychology that small children quite naturally seem to come to belief in God or something like God. And part of that is through something like a design intuition. When they look at the world, they just see design everywhere. They think everything has a purpose. And there seems to be something intrinsic to the human mind that when we look at the natural world, we think it's designed. And that's what I would call a design intuition. Just you look at the world and you just immediately perceive or apprehend or come to the belief that there's some kind of designer there. But a design argument is more technical. It is kind of a formalization of the intuition. It looks at a specific part of nature and it argues that there's some real reason to think that that is a design. It's not just a belief that forms, but it's a conclusion that's argued to. So it has premises and it has logical connections between them, and that gives you a conclusion. So the famous example recently is fine-tuning in physics, which I'll mention briefly soon. So that's just an important distinction, that I think everyone automatically has some kind of design intuitions. At least small children seem to. But design arguments are a technical formalization of that. And you could draw an analogy between religious experience and theology. Religious experiences just happen to people, but theology is like a systematization of a bunch of different religious experiences that different people have had over different times, or religious claims or beliefs. What's the general structure of design arguments? I suggest the core insight is something like there's a feature of the world that seems like it's really rare out of all the total possibilities that could exist. So there's this feature which is rare, surprising. That's the first component, and the second component is it should be the kind of feature that God could be interested in if we want to make a design argument for theism. So if naturalism is true, it's presumed that anything could happen equally as likely as anything else. So that's the presumed default for naturalism, is that the total possibility space. So something is rare in the total possibility space, roughly it's taken to be rare given naturalism. But if that same thing is not likely, not expected to be rare if God exists, then that's taken as evidence for theism, if this thing does actually exist in the world. Or condensed, I would say it's an inference from something which is rare and valuable to the existence of a personal agent who chose that thing. So if most of the universes are kind of dull and boring, but there's something special about this one, you can make a design inference that maybe this universe was designed. That's the rough logic of a design argument. And maybe the most well-known, or and at least most discussed in the technical literature recently, is the design argument in cosmology. So that's that the initial conditions of the universe and the parameters of the fundamental laws are highly fine-tuned for the existence of life. And that means that a relatively tiny change in any of one of many factors would mean that the universe was not life-permitting. So that's one way in which a design argument has been investigated, but there's lots more that have been investigated over history. And maybe the ones in biology have historically been more prominent, but have lost popularity, of course, in the last couple of centuries because of the work of Charles Darwin and evolutionary theory. There are many design arguments outside biology, not just the ones in cosmology. You can see the applicability of mathematics as just design arguments, fine-tuning that I've mentioned, both in the constants and in the initial conditions. There's various examples of fine-tuning in chemistry that are discussed by people such as Michael Denton, for instance. There's fine-tuning in astronomy or planetary science that's discussed a lot by Hugh Ross in Reasons to Believe. There's also special events in geological history, and these are discussed by both Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross, and also Michael Denton has nice examples of each of these things. And I would summarize a few of these things together as saying, to me, it looks like there's just a big picture of progressive development over time. To me, it's really impressive that we start with the Big Bang and we complexify. There seems to be a strange trend towards complexity, which to me looks like a designed narrative. that we should start with the Big Bang and end with the human brain and such is not at all something that we should take for granted given naturalism. It seems like at least the beginnings of some kind of design argument. And the point I want to make here is, well, there's a couple of points. Firstly, there's a lot of design arguments outside biology. So whatever you think of any biological design argument, the ones I give today, it could be that there's other ones that you might find more promising. And secondly, there's a kind of design argument that is relevant to evolution because evolution needs some things in order to happen. So in order to have evolution, you need to have life. You need to have a certain kind of life. It needs to have certain properties. And it turns out in order to have these things, you need some kind of prior design, I would say. But that's kind of a separate talk. And this is the kind of thing that Michael Denton, again, I'd say is particularly good at exploring. But my focus is going to be on biology. Another quick point about design arguments, which I think is important and maybe not too well recognized, is that all design arguments are conditional or hypothetical. And by that, I mean that they're conditional in the current state of science. So the premise, the initial premises in any design argument will be, okay, given that if we were to change the initial parameters of the universe, then this would happen. Or given that given that there's irreducible complexity in the cell, or all different kinds of design arguments, they start with a scientific premise. And that means that if the science regarding that premise changes, then the design argument will need to change as well. And some people see that as a downside of design arguments, but I don't think it really is. Because I think it just means that design arguments and science are closely correlated. So that allows scientists to explore and revise design arguments as they explore and revise science. So if you don't agree with a particular scientific claim, that's fine. I think that often there'll still be something in that design argument which is getting at something interesting about the world, even if the specifics of the science might change. I think often there is, often design arguments will survive through different scientific theories, but we have to be careful in making design arguments. And we should always say that they're conditional on the current state of science that they're based on. So it's not a weakness that they're contingent. And it's particularly not a weakness when we're using design arguments in a conversation with naturalism, because naturalism is usually defined in terms of scientific beliefs. To specify that a bit more, naturalism is a belief that only nature exists. And the only way that a naturalist can know what is in nature is through science. So if you want to talk with a naturalist about their worldview, it's a really good place to start, is to start with science. And that's the strength of design arguments, actually, that they are based on the current science. A lot of naturalists haven't really thought, what is naturalism? But it's very hard to define naturalism without at least some reference to science, either current science, which we know and can talk about, or future science, which we don't know and can't really say much about. So I think it's a real strength of design arguments that they're based on science, and that makes them a good place to start when talking with a naturalist. Okay, the first substantive point will be some discussion around common descent. This will be controversial, of course, so I look forward to any questions. I just want to quickly spell out why I think there are reasons to believe that common descent, or something quite like it, is true. I'll come back to this point a bit later, I think, but in general, in order to have design, and I'll explain in some detail, you don't need to have discontinuity, and you don't need to destroy Darwinism. And just a quick example of that is that you can imagine a factory which is fully automated by robots. You can still make a design inference when you look at the output of that factory. So the fact that there are mechanical processes or non-physical processes behind something doesn't rule out design regarding the product. It just pushes the design a level back. And I think that's roughly what I'm doing with the evolutionary design arguments, is I'm saying evolution doesn't get rid of the design, it just pushes it back a level. And I think design is usually like that. It's very hard to get rid of if a design inference is good. Okay, so common descent. One, I think, nice way to illustrate this is if you look at different kinds of mammals that look quite like a house mouse, which you may see in your walks around train stations, for instance. You often see a house mouse. And there's a lot of animals that look quite like a house mouse, but they're not the same species. And the things that are actually quite vastly different genetically to a house mouse, but they'd still be quite hard to distinguish by sight in terms of the general anatomy and that kind of thing. So even a rat is relatively similar to a house mouse genetically. And there's other things that look very much like a mouse, but they're not. So the question for someone who rejects common descent is, where does common descent stop? Do we stop it just at the level of the species? We say that maybe, for instance, God created each species separately. That would mean that the house mouse is not related to the rat. But most people who've thought about these things, who are biologists, who are aware of the genetic data, will say, well, the house mouse is related to the rat. They're not in the same species, but they're in the same family. And there's different taxonomic levels that you can go up, and you can keep pushing back and say, okay, well, where do we stop at the levels? And the general intuition for me behind common descent is it's very hard to work out where to stop. And it's very hard to draw lines here. You can keep going up. I think that's the suborder, then the order taxonomically. And you can keep going wider and wider. And I can't see a clear place based on either genetics or morphology where it's really clear that these are distinct units of creation, distinct kinds. So that's one of the key inferences behind common descent, is there seems to be a kind of continuity, at least in many areas of life, that make it very hard to draw lines at an early level. So that means whatever you think of common descent as a big picture, everyone accepts common descent in some level. The house mice that I saw back in New Zealand, everyone accepts that they're related ultimately to the house mouse that I might see in Germany. And then most people will accept that even the mice and rats are genetically related to each other, but they're quite different. They're, I think, approximately 10% of their genome, depending on how you count it, is different, which is an interesting number because that's the same number, roughly, that for the similarity between humans and chimpanzees. So this is not just a theoretical discussion to have that creationists can happily have with each other. I think they need to be careful for consistency. If we want to say that it's definitely not the case that humans and chimpanzees shared a common ancestor, if we want to do that on the basis of the genetics, then we should be careful when making claims about other organisms as well. And for me, it's very hard to draw these lines, and that's part of the reason why I think common descent is a reasonable inference. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot more that can be said about that. I welcome questions, but then another question that comes is, okay, well, what's the mechanism behind common descent? And I think a really nice explanation of this mechanism, of one of the pieces of evidence for the mechanism being mutation, ultimately, is written by Steve Schaffner, who Richard mentioned a few minutes ago, and this is available at the Biologos website, where he shows that for various different kinds of comparisons that you can make, you see basically the same rate of different kinds of mutations, the mutations from G to C or from A to T at the nucleotide level. Whichever pairwise comparison you're doing, it looks remarkably similar. And that's very surprising if these things were created separately, but it fits perfectly with what we'd expect if the differences are ultimately driven by the same kind of mutational processes. And for a really nice explanation of that, please check out the Biologos website. There's a lot of things on Biologos that I would be careful about. I think they're not very scientifically careful necessarily, but this is a really nice article. Okay. There are some arguments, of course, against common descent. I just want to briefly flag them just to show that I'm aware of them, and that I think they're not as knockdown arguments as they might seem to someone who's outside the field, for instance. They can seem very persuasive, but I think they're really not, at least for me so far. So the first major argument is that when you look at different genes and you compare their supposed histories, their phylogenetic trees, people will say, well, these gene trees are inconsistent with each other. And this is, of course, very well known that there's widespread phylogenetic incongruence, that different phylogenetic trees don't map onto each other perfectly, as we might naively expect. And there are various responses, of course, which professional evolutionary biologists will give to this. Firstly, there are known reasons accounting for many incongruencies. Incomplete lineage sorting, long branch attraction. These are just the names of some technical processes which are well documented in the literature and well understood from modeling and from real life examples. So these are not, often if you read the creationist or intelligent design literature, you'll get the impression that these responses are just ad hoc kind of excuses by evolutionary biologists to deal with the real problem of incongruence. But from my perspective, they're not simply ad hoc excuses. They're based on modeling, and they're based on real world examples. And these processes, I think, are quite well understood, and they make perfect sense, I think. So there's good reason to expect many incongruencies. It doesn't necessarily deal with all of them, but they need to be dealt with very carefully on a case-by-case basis. And the fact that there is widespread incongruence is not actually unexpected on the basis of these properties, which you can look up for more explanation. So in my opinion, in contrast, arguments against common descent often appear ad hoc or inconsistent. And what I mean by that is that I think if you want a successful argument against common descent, then it should apply outside of taxonomic groups. It should only apply outside of the taxonomic groups, which the person proposing the argument believes share a common ancestor. So for instance, if the person who is against common descent does accept that mice and rats share a common ancestor, then the argument shouldn't apply against mice and rats sharing a common ancestor. So for instance, phylogenetic incongruence will apply at very low levels like mice and rats, at least to some extent. So someone who accepts on the basis of other evidence that mice and rats do share a common ancestor needs to be really careful that they're not being inconsistent in the way that they're applying the counter arguments. They're only using it against the positions which they disagree with, and they're not using it against themselves, even though the same arguments would equally apply. So the way I see that is that we need a negative control, that we should only, that the same argument should apply at every taxonomic level that we're discussing, unless we have principled reasons for separating them out from each other. Okay, that's just very quickly one of the major arguments that you might hear about common descent in the context of genomics. And the second main one, perhaps, is what's known as orphan genes, or orphans or taxonomically restricted genes, TRGs. And these are genes which are restricted to a genome, to a single genome, or a species, or a small taxonomic group, depending on your definitions. And for a lot of people, this was really surprising, that when we sequence more and more genomes, we find these genes which don't seem to share common ancestry with other genes. And this is often proposed as some kind of argument against common descent. And that's because it's not expected to be widespread. If we think that the origin of new genes is difficult for evolution, then we shouldn't see new genes popping up again and again with every genome that we sequence. And there's lots of things I could say about orphan genes. I'm very interested in this topic. But maybe my main response is that, well, the actual data for orphan genes hasn't been shown to fit well with any non-evolutionary model either. So it's not really a point in favor of a particular creationist or an intelligent design model if it hasn't actually been shown to support that model over against evolutionary ones. And it's related to the last point, is that orphan genes almost seem to happen too often for the creationist as well, because they happen within individual species or genomes. And most creationists now will accept that there's a bunch of species that are related to each other, like mice and rats sharing a common ancestor. If you find orphan genes only found in mice, then the creationist also has the problem, where do they come from? And if the creationist says, well, they evolved, then orphan genes are no longer a problem for evolution in general. So if orphan genes are happening a lot, then they're somewhat mysterious, but they're not any more a problem for evolution than for other models, until those models are really specified in detail, which is yet to happen. For one nice example of an orphan gene, you can see our paper, which we've just, our manuscript, which has just been produced, and which is available in bioRxiv, relating to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is causing the current pandemic. So we believe that we've found something like an orphan gene, taxonomically restricted gene, which is found in only very few genomes. It's not found in the more distant SARS virus, but it's only found in a couple of very closely related viruses. So this is one very recent example of something which looks like it's something like an orphan gene. And SARS is in general very closely related to SARS-CoV-2. So this is not a large evolutionary distance at all. But orphan genes just seem to pop up very regularly. And yeah, so I'm not convinced that they're really an argument against evolution. They seem to happen quite naturally from my perspective, but I welcome feedback on that. Okay, this is just the general picture that we're talking about when you're talking about common descent. Okay, so that's the end of that section. The next section is on how do we get these things together? How do we have evolution compatible design arguments? And this is one graph, which I'll explain soon. So there's three different ways that I would structure the possibilities for evolution compatible design arguments. So I'll flick through these and then I'll come back and talk about them. So the first one is fine-tuning in evolutionary history. The second one is fine-tuning in initial conditions, which I'll talk about a bit. And the third one is fine-tuning in evolutionary parameters. So those are the three classes, but I'll be focusing on the second one, especially because I'm particularly interested in the structure of the genetic code. But the first one is that in some sense, I think we can talk about fine-tuning or something like that in evolutionary history. And by fine-tuning here, I mean just really improbable events. So this is maybe the easiest kind of design argument that a lot of people will be sympathetic to. So there's a bunch of things in evolution that are reasonably well acknowledged to have been very unlikely. And I think we can build some kind of design argument from these, that if they're very unlikely, given the total possibility space, that means they're very unlikely given naturalism, but they might not be very unlikely given theism. And if that's true, then we can use them as part of a design argument. And there's lots of examples of this: the origin of life, of course, the origin of the first eukaryotic cell. And this was possibly through some kind of symbiosis between an archaeal cell and a bacterial cell. I'm interested in the origin of endogenous retroviruses and vertebrate genomes. So that means short sections of DNA that ultimately came from a virus that have been shown to be very useful in the genomes of mammals, for instance. And there's some very interesting examples that for some reason are particularly to do with the mammalian placenta. So they're involved in early development and birth. And there's a few examples of this where some genes that look very clearly to have come from viruses somehow got involved in this crucial process of early development and birth. And to me, this looks incredibly surprising on the standard picture, but maybe there's some kind of design argument there. And I think each of these could be explored in some detail. And of course, the origin of life has received a lot of attention, and we'll get some in the next few days. And then also very interesting is the origin of the human brain, which one famous researcher in New Zealand, Professor Sir Richard Fall, who's the father of brain research in New Zealand, he calls the human brain the Rolls Royce of brains. It's the most impressive. When you can line up the different brains of different creatures, the human brain is just doing things that other brains are not doing. So, and the origin of that involved a whole bunch of new things, which to me seem kind of surprising. I don't see this as an argument against evolution per se, but to me it looks like, well, maybe there's something else going on here. None of these by themselves is a hugely strong design argument, but they can be premises which together I think can build quite a strong case. That there seems to be points in evolutionary history where something else may have been needed beyond the normal processes. Another example, of course, which is famous, is the bacterial flagellum. And this is a little outboard motor that a lot of different bacteria have to swim through the liquid that they live in. And there's a bunch of literature on this. This outboard motor is made up of 40 or 50 different proteins. And it's hard to imagine basically how it came together through a standard unguided evolutionary process. The point I want to make here is that even if it did come about through a standard evolutionary process, to me that process looks quite designed. So just because something has a mechanistic explanation doesn't mean it also doesn't have a design explanation. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can say here, that it doesn't really matter whether it evolved or not, it still looks like it was designed, and it still looks incredibly surprising that it should end up the way that it has. So I'm not worried whether the flagellum has an evolutionary explanation. I'm just interested in whether it ultimately has a design explanation as well. And I think you can run that kind of argument. Okay, but the focus today will be fine-tuning and initial conditions. And by initial conditions, I basically mean the origin of life or early life. Because a lot of people in evolutionary biology are recognizing that the early stages of life really set the stage for the later stages, that later evolution depends on what happened very early on. The early components often ended up gaining or having functions in later stages, which couldn't have been anticipated early on, but are quite surprising. So to me, there's a few kind of design hints there. But the one that I'll focus on today is the structure of the genetic code, which seems to me and to quite a few others to be set up to promote evolution in a few different ways. And so these are the three ways I'll discuss today. And hopefully at least some of this is new to people, even those who work in this area. Firstly, quite well known is the effect of single mutations is minimized in the genetic code. And I'll explain why that is and how that's relevant to evolution. Secondly, the effect of even frame shift mutations is minimized. And this is very surprising, and it's a new result that just came out a few months ago in PNAS, and I'll explain that. And then thirdly, some work that my group is working on is that there seems to be a trade-off in the structure of the genetic code, which helps the formation of overlapping genes. Okay, what is the genetic code though? There's different ways to think about it, but I think a useful way is it's the whole system which relates the nucleotides, which are triplet, which in sets of 3 in codons encode amino acids. This is a particular molecule, a tRNA, which does this interaction that mediates between the nucleotide level down here and the amino acid level up on the top right. And the genetic code basically is the set of biological machines which facilitates this relationship between nucleotides and amino acids, which leads to the building of proteins. And one of the most well-known effects about the genetic code is that single mutations have relatively minimal effect. And you can see this in this picture up on the right. And the picture is colored by the biochemical properties, roughly, of the amino acids. And you see that they group together. And that means that if you change a single letter here, if you change from UUU, this is the code, this is for the RNA level. If you change from UUU to UUC, it doesn't have any effect on the amino acid that's encoded. You still get this one. But if you change from UUU to UUA, you get a different amino acid, a leucine, but it has basically the same biochemical properties. So even when you do change to a different amino acid, they tend to have the same properties, much more than you'd expect by chance. So this is a very surprising feature of the code, and it's been estimated at something like 1 out of 1 million possible codes would have this kind of property, but it depends very much how you define it. But it's basically universally recognized now that this is an extreme optimality which the code has. Less well known is that this actually facilitates Darwinian evolution. And there's a few papers on this. This is one of them, where it says that the standard genetic code enhances adaptive evolution of proteins. And that's because of a fairly technical thing, which is can be illustrated with a model called Fisher's geometric model of evolution, which basically means that small changes are much more useful for evolution than large changes. So if the code is set up so that most mutations have relatively small effect, this will help evolution a lot, because it means you don't, most large mutations are going to be damaging. And this is just a simple result actually of the fact that you can illustrate it with this diagram, which shows movement towards a fitness peak in the middle. And if you think about the geometric structure of this, it turns out that very short arrows are more likely to be going towards the middle than very long arrows representing larger mutations. This is a general property of Darwinian evolution, which means that, yeah, for Darwinian evolution, you prefer small mutations, and the code seems to be set up to facilitate those. So this is a nice result of the robustness of the code against mutations. It also allows small-scale Darwinian evolution. Yeah, there's more that can be said about this, but the second thing I want to raise is this new paper, which has just been published fairly recently in PNAS, where they show the really surprising result that even frame shift mutations, where you shift to a different reading frame. So that's, you have this set of 9 nucleotides on the left, but if for some reason one of the nucleotides gets deleted, you start reading this in sets of 3, you read very different amino acids when you get a frame shift than if you just changed, if you change the ATG to a CTG, you'd have very little effect. But a frame shift should have a very large effect. But it turns out even frame shifts have been minimized by the structure of the code, the effect they have, because the kinds of amino acids that are encoded by frame shifted codons are very similar in terms of their hydrophobicity to the initial amino acids before the frame shift. And this is very useful for evolution, I think. And what it means is that you can make massive changes in sequence space in terms of the amino acids that are encoded. But because of the properties of those amino acids, you're close in property space. That means the effect is actually relatively small. And this is exactly what you need for evolution to proceed. So this is discussed in this nice paper fairly recently. That was the second one. And the third one is something which we're currently working on, which I'll just briefly sketch, is that there seems to be actually a few properties of the code, but just one in particular, that allows overlapping genes to be created at a much higher rate than you'd expect by with a random code. And this is just showing that in the different possible reading frames, the effect of mutations is remarkably consistent across reading frames. So the effect of mutation is the blue dots. And we find, we'd expect by chance, we'd expect vastly differing effects of mutations in different reading frames. But it turns out they're remarkably similar. And a model that we're working on and that will hopefully come out soon shows that this is actually really helpful for allowing you to explore sequence space. And if you're interested in that, I can send you our manuscript on that. But this is just one example, and there's a few more, I think, that show that the code seems to be set up not just for robustness, which is well known, but also for exploring sequence space, which allows evolution to happen. Okay, and this is a review that we wrote fairly recently that discusses some of these things, where you can get some of that. Okay, that was the second one, that initial conditions in evolution also seem to be fine-tuned. The last one, just very briefly, is fine-tuning evolutionary parameters. By that I mean the general shape of evolution. That the general structure of evolutionary theory seems to be fine-tuned in a few ways. And this is something that I'm just kind of starting to collect together, but there's quite a few papers I think are relevant to this. Yeah, so one example is that transcription factors seem to be much more evolvable than you'd expect by chance. That means, and transcription factors are key in terms of turning genes on and off, in terms of creating new evolutionary features. And if these are really evolvable, that's really helpful for evolution. And this is just one example of something that's fundamental to evolution, which seems to be set up to allow more evolution to happen. In general, the question for evolution is how do we relate genotype, which is the nucleotide level changes, to phenotype, the structural level changes. And I think it looks like you need a very specific kind of mapping in order for evolution to happen. You basically need the map to be designed in order for evolutionary progress to happen. That's a controversial claim, and fleshing it out will take, unfortunately, a lot more detail, but this is the kind of thing that I want to argue. That evolution, in order to proceed, needs an underlying design framework. Okay. Now I come to just a couple of conclusions, just one response in particular, and then I'll wrap it up. So the response that a lot of people say is, well, this is all very complicated. How could this be useful for actually making a design argument? I prefer my simple flagellum is too complicated to evolve kind of design argument. And my response to that is, well, unfortunately, science is complicated. And that's just what we have to deal with as scientists. Maybe more helpfully is that lots of intuitions seem simple at first, and then when we dig into them, the underlying workings, I think, are complicated. That's fine. The question is whether we can save the intuition. Can we save the design intuition? Similarly, a lot of theology is complicated when we really dig into it, but you can still summarize it simply. I think you can summarize the design intuition very simply, but really defending it is going to be complicated because the molecular biology just is complicated. So I think these kinds of things that I've sketched out today actually help to strengthen the initial design intuition. And because basically what they show is it's very hard to get rid of design. Even if you tell an evolutionary story of how something came to be, you haven't dealt with the central design question, which is that something which is rare and valuable points to a designer. If interesting biological complexity is both rare and valuable, and I think that can be argued in lots of different ways, then it points to a designer, whether it arose through evolution or not. So I think there's compatibility between William Paley's watch and the modern science of phylogenetics. And with that, I look forward to your questions.